I was sitting on my own $12,000 custom Italian leather sectional, watching the final critical quarter of a playoff football game, when my daughter-in-law marched into the room and violently ripped the television remote directly from my hand. "Go back to your room, old man," she said, her voice dripping with absolute venom as she changed the channel to some mindless reality television garbage without even bothering to look me in the eye. This is our living room now. The funny thing was, I had personally paid for every single brick, every imported hardwood floorboard, and that exact 85-inch screen television in that house. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or demand basic respect. I simply stood up, walked back down to my basement suite, and the very next morning I called a commercial moving company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly stand your ground against a family member who severely underestimated your worth and your power. The bitter chill in the basement suite woke me a full hour before my alarm was set to ring. I reached for the smart thermostat panel mounted on the drywall to bump the ambient heat up a few degrees, but the digital screen flashed a bright red error message. Access denied. I grabbed my iPad from the nightstand to check the local network connection, assuming there was a simple router error. The Wi-Fi signal was completely gone. The network name, which had been set as Mercer Home for the past 2 years, was no longer listed on the available connections. In its place was a newly established password-locked network titled Brooke and Trevor's Sanctuary. I tapped the screen, feeling the freezing air seeping through the floorboards above me as the reality of the situation set in. Brooke had locked me out of the environmental controls and the internet connection because she claimed my tablet usage was slowing down her evening streaming services. I did not march upstairs to bang on their bedroom door and demand the new password. I simply switched my tablet over to my secure cellular data plan. I had an entire logistics empire to monitor, even in my supposed retirement. My son Trevor thought I had been a mid-level manager at a regional shipping firm who had retired on a rapidly depleting pension. He thought I moved into his basement because I had nowhere else to go after his mother Patricia passed away from a sudden illness. He did not know that 3 years ago I orchestrated the sale of Mercer Freight and Logistics for a sum that would make his head spin. I kept the millions carefully hidden in offshore accounts and commercial blind trusts because I knew my son better than anyone. I knew his ambition was fragile, easily corrupted by the promise of unearned wealth. I wanted him to build his own life and earn his own pride. Instead, he had married Brooke. I opened my email to review a commercial supply invoice for a massive warehouse property I still leased out to a national retailer. But right beneath that high-level financial document was an automated alert from my personal banking application. A fresh transaction had just been processed on the specific credit card I kept linked to Trevor's emergency household account. $800 had been charged at 7 in the morning to a high-end boutique appliance store downtown. I opened the banking portal, staring at the exact numbers glowing on the glass screen. They had not asked me for a loan. They had not mentioned a plumbing failure or a broken furnace. They had simply taken the money. I calmly pulled up the regional utility portal and used that same cellular data connection to pay the $200 monthly internet bill for the very Wi-Fi network Brooke had just locked me out of. I needed my financial ledger to be absolutely flawless for the storm that was coming next. I put on my slippers and walked slowly up the wooden stairs to the main floor. The rich, heavy smell of roasted espresso beans and warm vanilla hit my face before I even pushed open the door to the kitchen. Trevor and Brooke were standing at the center of the massive kitchen island, laughing together as they pulled away the protective foam packaging from a towering, gleaming chrome espresso machine. The countertops, which I had personally paid $60,000 to upgrade to imported Brazilian quartz just 8 months prior, were covered in empty cardboard boxes and glossy instruction manuals. I stepped into the kitchen, letting the door click shut behind me. Trevor looked up, his laughter dying instantly in his throat. He shifted his weight nervously, stepping slightly in front of the chrome machine as if his body could somehow block it from my view. I pointed directly at the appliance. "Is that the $800 emergency that just hit my credit card?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely level and devoid of emotion. Trevor rolled his eyes and let out an exaggerated sigh, adopting the posture of an annoyed teenager being questioned by a foolish parent. "Dad, it was an emergency house expense," he said, crossing his arms over his chest in a defensive stance. "We entertain important clients here for my firm. We absolutely cannot serve them cheap drip coffee from a plastic pot. It is an investment in my career progression." Brooke did not even bother to look up at me. She was too busy polishing the side of the shiny machine with a microfiber cloth, admiring her own reflection in the metal. She wrinkled her nose aggressively and waved her free hand in the air to fan the space between us. "Trevor, can we please keep the basement door closed from now on?" she complained, her voice dripping with unapologetic disgust. "The basement smell is drifting up here, and it completely ruins the modern aesthetic of the kitchen." I stood there in absolute silence, taking in the full measure of the scene. My only son standing on the expensive hardwood floors I bought, defending a blatant theft to appease a woman who was visibly insulted by my mere existence. I did not yell at them. I did not demand that they pack up the machine and return it to the boutique. I simply walked over to the nearest custom oak cabinet and pulled out a ceramic mug. "Since I paid for the machine, I would like a cup of coffee," I said quietly. Brooke immediately physically stepped between me and the espresso maker, holding her hands up as if I were carrying a weapon. "Oh no, Stanley," she said, speaking to me with the slow, highly condescending tone one might use when addressing a confused toddler. "This machine is highly calibrated for premium beans. It is far too complex and delicate for you to be messing around with. You will end up breaking the pressure valve." She reached into the walk-in pantry, pulled out a cheap plastic jar of freeze-dried instant coffee granules, and slammed it onto the quartz counter right next to my empty mug. "Use the microwave," she ordered. I looked at the jar of instant dust. I looked at my son, who suddenly found the grout lines on the floor absolutely fascinating, completely refusing to intervene or defend his father. I unscrewed the plastic lid, spooned the bitter brown granules into my mug, and filled it with cold tap water from the sink. I put it in the stainless steel microwave and pressed start. The loud hum of the appliance filled the heavy, suffocating silence in the room. When the timer beeped, I took my mug of lukewarm, muddy water and leaned against the edge of the island. I drank the coffee in total silence. I looked at the custom oak cabinetry, the stainless steel 6-burner industrial stove, the imported geometric tile backsplash. Every single luxurious element in this room had been paid for by my secret accounts to give my son a substantial head start in his adult life. I swallowed the bitter, metallic-tasting coffee, meticulously calculating the exact dollar amount of the room surrounding them. I did not say another word. I turned my back to them and walked back down to my basement. The tension in the house escalated entirely by Thursday evening. I came up the stairs around 8 o'clock to grab a bottle of water because the small, outdated refrigerator in my basement suite had stopped functioning the day before. As I pushed open the door to the main hallway, a massive wave of loud, overlapping chatter and the sharp clinking of wine glasses washed over me. Brooke was hosting an impromptu wine night for 5 of her closest friends. They were gathered tightly around the kitchen island, picking at an expensive, sprawling charcuterie board and laughing at maximum volume. I kept my head down, not wanting to interrupt their gathering, and walked straight toward the massive Sub-Zero refrigerator built into the corner. It was a refrigerator I had purchased in cash for $12,000 when Brooke complained for weeks that the standard model did not keep her organic produce crisp enough. Before my hand could even touch the stainless steel handle, Brooke materialized out of thin air. She practically sprinted across the kitchen floor and aggressively shoved her shoulder against the refrigerator door, physically blocking my access with her body. She pressed her back against the cold steel, glaring at me with wide, furious eyes. "What are you doing up here?" she hissed under her breath, ensuring her friends could not hear the venom in her tone. "I just need a single bottle of water," I replied quietly, maintaining my composure and not wanting to cause a humiliating scene in front of her guests. The women at the island had stopped talking entirely. They were all staring directly at us, their expensive wine glasses suspended awkwardly in the air. Brooke instantly plastered a tight, deeply pitying smile onto her face and turned to address her friends. "I am so sorry, ladies," she announced, her voice suddenly dripping with a sickly sweet, manufactured compassion. "My father-in-law gets a bit confused at night. The doctor says his mind wanders terribly when the sun goes down. He really needs to be certain in his room." She turned back to me, her eyes remaining hard, calculating, and completely devoid of empathy. "Come on, Stanley. Let us get you back down to your room before you accidentally hurt yourself." She grabbed my forearm, her manicured acrylic nails digging sharply and painfully into my skin, and forcefully steered me away from the refrigerator and directly back toward the basement door. She did not offer to hand me a bottle of water. She simply shoved me into the dark stairwell and pulled the heavy wooden door shut, locking the deadbolt from the other side with a loud, echoing, deeply final click. I stood in the absolute dark on the top step. I could clearly hear her friends murmuring soft sounds of sympathy for her on the other side of the wood, actively praising her for dealing with such a heavy, tragic burden with such immense grace. I walked slowly down the stairs to my cold, concrete-walled suite. I did not turn on the television to drown out the noise of their laughter. I did not try to go to sleep and forget the insult. I walked deliberately over to my small desk, opened my laptop, and bypassed the blocked residential Wi-Fi using my encrypted cellular hotspot. I logged directly into the secure county property records portal. I navigated through the digital municipal files until I found the exact legal deed to the property. $1.2 million in prime suburban real estate. The document loaded on my screen, crisp, legally binding, and completely undeniable. The property was solely entirely in my name, Stanley Mercer. Trevor and Brooke were legally nothing more than month-to-month tenants residing at my exclusive discretion. I stared at the bright screen in the dark room, listening to the muffled sounds of Brooke boasting to her friends above my head. The time for enduring their abuse had officially expired. The trap was permanently set. The afternoon light filtered poorly into my basement suite the next day. I had spent the entire morning reviewing the digital property deed on my laptop, ensuring every legal barrier was firmly in place. When my stomach finally demanded a meal, I walked up the wooden stairs to the main floor. The house was usually quiet at this hour, but today an unfamiliar nasal voice echoed from the formal dining room. I stopped in the hallway. I peered around the corner. A man in a cheap beige suit was running a jeweler's magnifying glass over the surface of a massive dark wood cabinet. It was not just any cabinet. It was a hand-carved solid mahogany hutch. My wife Patricia had found that hutch during a trip to the coast 30 years ago. She had spent an entire summer meticulously restoring it, polishing the wood with lemon oil until it gleamed like dark glass. When she passed away, the silence in our old home became unbearable. Trevor had begged me to move into this new house with him. He had stood in my old living room, pointed directly at that mahogany hutch, and told me he wanted his mother's memory to anchor his new home. That was the only reason I had agreed to fund this massive property. I wanted to keep Patricia's legacy alive for the family. Now this stranger was tapping his knuckles against the glass doors, clicking his tongue in a hollow rhythm. Brooke stood next to him, her arms crossed over her chest, holding a digital tablet. The appraiser told Brooke the market for heavy antique furniture was completely dead. He said it was too bulky for modern buyers and required too much maintenance. He offered her $400 in cash to haul it away that very afternoon. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to a stranger put a pathetic price tag on 30 years of my wife's devotion. Brooke did not hesitate. She actually laughed. She told the appraiser that $400 was perfectly fine. She waved her hand dismissively at the beautiful dark wood, calling it depressing junk. She complained to the stranger that the hutch was completely ruining her vision for a modern minimalist aesthetic. She wanted everything in the dining room to be white, sterile, and empty. She wanted to erase the last physical trace of Patricia from the house to make room for a plastic decorative sculpture she had seen on the internet. She told the dealer to bring his truck around to the back patio so they could get the garbage out of her sight immediately. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and walked directly into the dining room. I did not raise my hands. I did not shout. I kept my voice at a dead-even calm that carried the weight of absolute authority. I looked directly at the appraiser and told him to close his checkbook. I told him to pick up his magnifying glass, walk out the front door, and never return to this address. The man froze. He looked at Brooke for confirmation, but he could hear the uncompromising finality in my tone. Brooke's face turned a violent shade of red. She stepped between me and the dealer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. She yelled that I had no right to interfere with her interior design choices. She demanded that the appraiser ignore me, claiming I was just a confused old man living in her basement who had no say in what happened upstairs. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked onto the dealer. I told him that if he touched one single piece of that mahogany wood, I would have him arrested for grand larceny. The dealer swallowed hard. He recognized the tone of a man who could easily destroy him. He packed his tools into his briefcase and practically sprinted out the front door. The heavy wooden door had barely clicked shut behind the fleeing appraiser when it immediately swung open again. Trevor walked into the foyer, loosening his expensive silk tie after a long day at the office. Brooke did not miss a single beat. The absolute second my son stepped into the house, she burst into theatrical, sobbing tears. She threw herself against his chest, burying her face in his expensive suit. She wailed that I had aggressively humiliated her in front of a hired professional. She cried that I was trying to control her life, that I was terrifying her in her own home, and that I was obsessing over useless garbage instead of letting her decorate her own living space. I stood perfectly still next to Patricia's hutch. I rested my hand on the polished mahogany. I waited. I waited for my son to look at the wood his mother had restored with her own blistered hands. I waited for him to remember the promises he had made to me when he begged me to bring this piece of our history into his home. I waited for a single ounce of loyalty or basic human decency to override the lies his wife was currently sobbing into his shirt. Trevor wrapped his arms around Brooke, holding her tight. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me across the dining room. There was no conflict in his eyes. There was no hesitation. He did not look at the mahogany hutch. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated annoyance. He treated me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into his pristine life and soiled his expensive rug. He took a deep breath, petting his wife's hair, and delivered the words that completely severed our bloodline. "It is our house, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with exhausted condescension. "We need to breathe. You are suffocating us." He told me to go back downstairs and stay out of their way. He told me that if I could not handle the reality of them upgrading their own property, I needed to find somewhere else to spend my afternoons. I did not argue. I did not remind him that my secret accounts had paid for the silk tie around his neck, the suit on his back, and the very floorboards he was currently standing on to insult me. I simply looked at the son I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. The boy who used to help his mother polish this exact piece of furniture was completely gone. Every shred of character, every moral foundation I had tried to build within him had been entirely hollowed out. He was completely corrupted. The transformation was absolute. I was no longer looking at my child. I was looking at a parasite that had convinced itself it owned the host. The smothering tension in the room did not break my spirit. It crystallized my resolve. I gave him a single silent nod. I turned my back on them and walked slowly toward the basement stairs. The time for observation was officially over. Sunday evenings used to mean something in our family. Before Patricia passed away, Sunday night, was an institution, a sacred block of time where the noise of the outside world was firmly shut out. I carried that tradition into this new house, hoping to salvage whatever remained of my bond with my son. I sat in the center of the massive living room, sinking slightly into the rich, dark brown cushions of the custom Italian leather sectional. I had paid $12,000 in cash for this exact piece of furniture. I did not buy it for the status or to boast about imported craftsmanship. I bought it because it was large enough for a family to stretch out on, durable enough to withstand the grandchildren I foolishly believed I would one day hold here. The leather was supple, retaining the faint, earthy scent of a tannery, a grounding smell that usually brought me a measure of peace. On the wall directly in front of me hung the 85-inch flat-screen television. It was another purchase I had made exclusively for Trevor. He had spent his entire adolescence obsessed with football, memorizing statistics, tracking players, and spending his Sunday evenings sitting shoulder to shoulder with me on our old, worn-out fabric sofa. I had envisioned us sitting here on this Italian leather, watching the playoffs, arguing over referee calls, and sharing the quiet, unspoken camaraderie that exists between a father and a grown son. Instead, I sat completely alone. The volume was kept meticulously low, barely a murmur above a whisper, because I knew the rules of the house had shifted. I was the ghost in the basement, permitted to surface only when the primary residence where other was occupied. The playoff game flickered across the massive screen, casting a shifting blue and green glow across the empty room. It was the fourth quarter. The tension of the game was palpable, a tight defensive battle that required absolute focus to appreciate. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself relax. I let the deep comfort of the leather and the familiar rhythm of the football game wash over the lingering sting of the past few days. I convinced myself that perhaps the tension could be managed. Perhaps the hostility was just a temporary phase. Perhaps the son I had raised was still somewhere inside the man upstairs, buried under layers of stress and bad decisions. That fragile illusion was violently shattered by the sound of the front door swinging open, followed immediately by the sharp, echoing clatter of high heels against the imported hardwood floor in the foyer. A chorus of loud, overlapping feminine voices flooded the house. Brooke had returned from her Sunday brunch, which had apparently bled seamlessly into a Sunday evening wine tasting. The smell of expensive, heavily oaked Merlot and sharp floral perfume rolled into the living room seconds before she did. I did not move from the sectional, keeping my eyes fixed on the television screen, hoping my silent presence would simply be ignored. I was wrong. Brooke marched into the living room, trailing 3 of her closest friends behind her, like a royal court entering a conquered territory. Her face was flushed, her posture rigid with an entitlement that seemed to vibrate off her skin. She stopped dead in her tracks, the absolute second she saw me occupying the center cushion of the sectional. The laughter of her friends died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. They stood awkwardly near the edge of the large Persian rug, shifting their weight, clutching their half-empty wine glasses, waiting to see how their hostess would handle the intrusion of the basement dweller. I did not mute the television, but I felt my muscles tighten. I slowly turned my head to acknowledge her presence, preparing to offer a polite, neutral greeting. I never got the chance to speak. Brooke did not pause. She did not ask me how my evening was going, or politely request that I turn the volume down. She moved with a sudden, aggressive burst of speed, closing the distance between the edge of the rug and the center of the sectional in 2 rapid strides. She lunged forward, her acrylic nails digging sharply into the flesh of my hand as she violently ripped the television remote directly from my grasp. The physical shock of the contact was jarring. It was not a casual swipe. It was a deliberate physical exertion of force, a physical assault designed to establish absolute dominance in front of an audience. The plastic casing of the remote scraped against my knuckles as she tore it away. I sat perfectly still, my hand still hovering in the empty air, where the remote had been just a fraction of a second before. Brooke stepped back, her chest heaving slightly, her eyes blazing with a toxic, triumphant fire. Without breaking eye contact with me, she aimed the remote at the 85-inch screen and aggressively punched a button. The gritty, high-stakes tension of the fourth-quarter playoff game vanished instantly. In its place, the bright, obnoxious pink and yellow graphics of a mindless reality television show flooded the massive screen. The shrill, manufactured voices of minor celebrities arguing over trivial garbage echoed through the living room, completely erasing the peaceful atmosphere I had been sitting in just moments prior. Her friends let out a synchronized, nervous giggle, emboldened by her aggressive display. Brooke tossed the remote onto the glass coffee table with a loud clatter. She placed her hands on her hips, towering over me where I sat on the leather cushions. I looked up at her, waiting for the demand, waiting for the excuse. When she spoke, her voice was dripping with absolute venom, completely devoid of any basic human respect or decency. "Go back to your room, old man," she commanded, enunciating every single syllable to ensure her friends caught the full weight of her authority. "This is our living room now." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. "Old man. Our living room." She did not simply want the television. She wanted the absolute humiliation of the man who had paid for it. She wanted to demonstrate to her audience that she had successfully subjugated her husband's father, that she was the undisputed master of the estate, and that I was nothing more than an unwanted pest, taking up space on her expensive furniture. The profound cruelty of the moment demanded a response. My pulse hammered steadily in my throat, a deep rhythmic thumping that signaled the rise of a fury I had kept buried for years. I was a man who had built a logistics empire from the ground up, negotiating with cutthroat corporate sharks and commanding warehouses full of hardened laborers. I could have destroyed her with a single sentence. I could have stood up, listed the exact cost of the room she was standing in, and demanded she leave my property immediately. I possessed the legal and financial power to render her homeless with a single phone call. But before I could draw the breath to speak, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Trevor had entered the room. My son stood in the wide archway connecting the living room to the kitchen. He was wearing the casual cashmere sweater I had purchased for him last Christmas, holding a glass of sparkling water. He had a direct, unobstructed view of the entire scene. He had seen his wife physically assault his father. He had heard her strip away my dignity and claim ownership of the room I had bought to keep him close. The fiery indignation building in my chest instantly turned to ice. I looked directly at my son. I waited for the spark of recognition, the sudden realization that a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. I waited for him to step forward, to intervene, to remind his wife that the man sitting on the couch was the reason they had a roof over their heads. I waited for Trevor to be a man. Trevor stopped in the archway. He looked at his wife standing victorious over me. He looked at her friends who were watching with barely concealed smirks. Then he looked at me. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. In that fleeting glance, I did not see an apology. I did not see conflict or shame. I saw profound irritation. I saw a man who was annoyed that his father had put him in the uncomfortable position of having to witness an unpleasant scene. Trevor immediately looked down at the bright screen of his smartphone. He raised his thumb and began to swipe aimlessly across the glass, pretending to be entirely absorbed in whatever digital nonsense was on the display. He turned his body, slightly angling his shoulder toward the kitchen, completely refusing to meet my eyes again. He abandoned me. In that exact second, the final lingering thread of my paternal hope was permanently severed. The illusion that I could save my son from his own weakness evaporated into the sterile, air-conditioned air of the living room. He was not a victim of Brooke's manipulation. He was a willing, active participant in my degradation. He had chosen his side, trading his honor and his father for the illusion of domestic peace and the continuation of his unearned luxury. The emotional tether that bound me to the boy I had raised dissolved, leaving behind a cold, calculating clarity. He was no longer my child. He was an adult who had made his choice. The silence in the room stretched out, punctuated only by the shrill voices radiating from the television screen. Brooke stood her ground, her chin raised, waiting for me to argue, waiting for the explosive confrontation she so desperately craved to validate her narrative that I was a hostile, difficult burden. I denied her that satisfaction. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not utter a single syllable of protest or defense. I slowly stood up from the $12,000 custom Italian leather sectional. I smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers with absolute, terrifying calm. I looked at the walls freshly painted in the stark, sterile white Brooke had demanded. I looked at the 85-inch television radiating garbage into the space I had built for family. I looked at the couch, the glass table, the imported rug. I looked at every single item my hidden millions had provided. I cataloged them in my mind, calculating their exact value mentally, detaching myself from the emotional weight they once held. They were no longer gifts. They were assets, waiting to be liquidated. I gave Brooke a single slow nod, a gesture of absolute chilling finality. I turned my back on her and her audience of sycophants. I walked across the living room, my footsteps steady and measured on the hardwood. I walked past the archway where my son stood staring intently at his phone. I did not pause. I did not look at him. I walked down the hallway, the sound of the reality show fading behind me, replaced by the heavy rhythmic thud of my own heartbeat. I reached the wooden door leading to the basement stairs. I opened it, stepped into the dark stairwell, and pulled the door shut behind me. I reached up and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed in the enclosed space, a physical manifestation of the boundary that had just been erected. I descended the stairs into the cold concrete suite. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I sat in the darkness, the silence of the basement wrapping around me like a heavy shroud. But it was no longer the silence of a victim enduring abuse. It was the silence of a tactician preparing for war. The emotional man who had moved into this house to protect his son was dead. The corporate shark who had built an logistics empire from the ground up had officially returned. I reached under my cot and pulled out the metal lockbox containing my financial ledgers. I opened it, the metal hinges squeaking in the quiet room. The time for endurance was over. The extraction had begun. The heavy brass deadbolt had clicked shut, and with that single metallic sound went the very last remnant of my paternal guilt. I walked slowly across the cold concrete floor, over to the small metal desk tucked into the far corner of my basement suite. It was a cheap, flimsy laminate piece I had picked up at a local hardware store, simply to have a place to rest my laptop. The irony of the situation was sharp and unmistakable. I sat in a subterranean windowless concrete box, working on a $70 desk, while the people living directly above my head lounged on imported Italian leather. I reached down, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a heavy fireproof lockbox. My fingers moved over the combination dial with absolute mechanical precision. 3 turns right, 2 turns left, 1 turn right. The lid popped open with a soft hiss of displaced air. Inside were 4 years of meticulously organized financial ledgers. I had kept every single receipt, every bank transfer confirmation, and every property deed since the day Trevor had called me weeping into the phone about how he could not afford to put a proper roof over his new bride's head. I carefully lifted the thick stacks of paper and placed them onto the laminate surface. The basement was completely silent now, save for the faint rhythmic hum of the municipal water heater humming in the utility closet behind me. I opened my laptop, bypassed their blocked residential network, using my cellular data, and pulled up a blank digital spreadsheet. The emotional accommodating father was dead. The corporate logistics operator had taken his seat at the table. I began to type. I did not merely look at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. I weighed them against the blood, the sweat, and the sheer exhaustion it had taken to earn them. Trevor believed my money came from a modest middle management pension. He did not know about the massive commercial logistics empire I had built from a single delivery truck into a fleet of hundreds. He did not know about the 40 years of missing dinners with his mother Patricia because a vital freight convoy was delayed in a storm in Seattle. He did not know about the decades of breathing toxic diesel fumes on freezing loading docks, just so he would never have to know the suffocating smell of poverty. I had sold the company for millions 3 years ago, but I kept the fortune buried in blind trusts and offshore accounts. I wanted my son to possess the hunger of a working man. Instead, he possessed the entitlement of a prince. I looked at the very first piece of paper in the stack. It was the official closing document for the property sitting directly above my head. $1.2 million paid entirely in cash. I typed the number into the spreadsheet. The digital cursor blinked back at me in the dim light. Next came the interior design invoices. Brooke had insisted the house was utterly unlivable without a complete floor-to-ceiling modern overhaul. I tallied the receipts for the custom-imported furniture she had painstakingly selected from European catalogs. $140,000. That specific total included the $12,000 sectional she had just aggressively banished me from. I added the figure to the column. I pulled out the kitchen remodel documents next. The 6-burner industrial stainless steel stove, the custom oak cabinetry, the Brazilian quartz countertops, and the $12,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator she had physically blocked me from accessing with her own body. The grand total for the appliances sat at exactly $45,000. Then came the home entertainment systems, the smart thermostats that were currently programmed to freeze me out of my own suite, the high-definition security cameras, the integrated surround sound, and the 85-inch screen Trevor used to watch his football games. $15,000 in pure, unadulterated electronic indulgence. I highlighted the final column on the screen and hit the sum key. $1,400,000. That was the precise mathematical value of their arrogance. That was the exact price I had paid to be treated like a feral, unwanted animal in my own home. They had consumed my wealth and digested it into absolute contempt. I looked at the final number glowing on the screen. I felt nothing. There was no anger left to burn. There was no sorrow left to weep over. There was just a cold, terrifying vacuum where my profound love for my only son used to reside. The heavy, oppressive silence of the basement was suddenly and violently shattered by a frantic pounding on the wooden door at the top of the stairs. The wood rattled fiercely against the doorframe. The impact was loud enough to send a thin layer of drywall dust drifting down from the ceiling joists above my desk. "Stanley, are you listening to me?" Brooke's voice pierced right through the solid wood. It was shrill, vibrating with a level of entitlement that made the air in the room feel physically heavy. She pounded on the door a second time, her fist striking the wood with undeniable rage. The metal handle jiggled aggressively as she tried to force the lock I had just engaged. "You cannot just walk away when I am speaking to you. You do not get to throw a tantrum and hide in the basement while I have guests over." I remained seated at my desk. I did not move a single muscle. I watched the white dust settle slowly onto my black keyboard. "Listen to me carefully, old man." Her voice dropped to a loud, venomous hiss. She was pressing her mouth right against the crack in the doorframe, ensuring every syllable slithered down the stairwell. "The property tax assessment arrived in the mail today. It is due by Friday. I slipped the envelope under the door before you locked it like a coward. You need to write the check and leave it on the kitchen counter by tomorrow morning. Trevor has a very important golf weekend coming up, and we absolutely cannot be dealing with your financial responsibilities right now. Pay the bill, Stanley. Do not make me come down there." The sheer magnitude of her audacity was almost breathtaking. She had physically assaulted me. She had ripped a remote from my hand in front of an audience. She had banished me to a concrete room. And now she was aggressively demanding I pay the thousands of dollars in municipal taxes required to keep a luxury roof over her head. She honestly believed I was a captive resource. She believed I was so desperately starved for my son's proximity that I would blindly finance my own daily degradation just to breathe the same air as him. She thought my silence was submission. I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels turning away from the door. I heard her walking back down the hallway to resume her wine night, her laughter echoing faintly as she rejoined her friends to undoubtedly mock my retreat. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the bottom of the stairs. Lying on the cold concrete floor just beneath the small gap in the wooden door was a thick manila envelope bearing the official county seal. I bent down and picked it up. I walked back to the laminate desk and sat down. I opened the envelope with a letter opener. The county property tax bill was substantial, reflecting the massive appreciation of the luxury renovations I had funded. I did not write a check. I did not reach for my wallet to calculate the deduction. I simply folded the heavy paper and slid it directly into a fresh green folder marked for immediate liquidation. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I completely bypassed the blocked residential network. I opened my encrypted contacts list and scrolled past Trevor's name without a single ounce of hesitation. I found the number I needed. Sylvia Russo. Sylvia was the ruthless corporate litigator who had successfully navigated the massive, highly complex sale of my logistics empire. She was a woman who dismantled hostile corporate takeovers for sport. She did not deal in emotions. She did not deal in family counseling. She dealt in absolute scorched earth victories. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was sharp, professional, and entirely awake despite the late hour. "Stanley," she answered, the sound of a keyboard clacking in the background. "It has been 3 years. Tell me someone is trying to steal your money so I can ruin their week." I looked at the spreadsheet glowing on my laptop screen. I looked at the $1.4 million my son had happily burned to the ground. I looked at the tax bill that Brooke had commanded me to pay. "Sylvia," I said, my voice dead and completely hollowed out. "Someone is trying to steal my house. I need you to ruin their entire lives." The morning air was aggressively cold as I drove my modest sedan into the towering steel and glass canyon of the downtown financial district. I parked in a subterranean concrete garage and took the elevator up to street level. The coffee shop Sylvia chose for our meeting was located on the ground floor of a massive corporate high-rise. It was a completely sterile environment. The walls were painted a stark, blinding white, and the tables were thick slabs of frosted glass resting on brushed steel frames. There was no comfortable seating, no soft lighting, and no warmth. It was a room explicitly designed for ruthless corporate transactions. It perfectly mirrored the absolute coldness that had settled permanently into my chest. Sylvia Russo was already sitting at a corner table by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that looked sharp enough to draw blood. Sylvia was a senior corporate litigator. She was a woman who dismantled hostile corporate takeovers for sport and navigated the billion-dollar sale of Mercer Freight and Logistics 3 years ago with terrifying efficiency. She did not deal in family counseling. She did not deal in emotional compromises. She dealt in absolute scorched earth victories. As I approached the glass table, I saw she had already ordered a black coffee for me. There were no pleasantries exchanged as I pulled out the metal chair and sat down. She did not ask how my morning was going. She simply looked at the thick green folder I held in my hand. I slid the heavy folder across the smooth glass surface. It came to a stop directly in front of her. Sylvia opened the cover and began to pull out the documents I had meticulously organized during my long night in the basement. She reviewed them with clinical precision. Her dark eyes scanned the official county property deed, proving I was the sole owner of the $1.2 million suburban estate. She turned the page. She reviewed the itemized spreadsheet detailing the $140,000 in custom-imported furniture, the $45,000 in high-end kitchen appliances, and the $15,000 in integrated home electronics. She finally looked at the official municipal property tax bill Brooke had shoved under my door like a piece of garbage. Sylvia aligned the papers into a neat stack. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She was looking at the financial anatomy of a parasite. She leaned back in her steel chair and interlaced her fingers. She knew me incredibly well. She knew the sacrifices I had made on the freezing loading docks 40 years ago to build the wealth now detailed on those papers. She also knew that the house currently in question was occupied by my only living child. Sylvia was a shark in a courtroom, but she possessed a sharp understanding of human nature. She knew the emotional gravity of what these documents truly represented, from a strictly legal standpoint. "This is incredibly simple," Sylvia said, keeping her voice low and even. "Because there is no formal lease agreement in place and because you have never collected a single dime of rent from them, Trevor and his wife are legally classified as month-to-month tenants at will. They possess zero equity in the property. Evicting them is nothing more than basic administrative paperwork." She paused, tapping her manicured index finger against the top of the property deed. She looked directly into my eyes, her expression shifting from a corporate litigator to someone who genuinely respected the man sitting across from her. "But you need to understand the absolute reality of what you are asking me to initiate," she warned, her tone softening, just a fraction. "If I file these papers, if I serve them with a formal eviction notice, the bridge will be burned to ash. You are initiating a hostile legal strike against your own blood. The second this notice touches their hands, there is no coming back. It will permanently sever your relationship with your son. You need to be completely certain you are prepared to carry that weight." I listened to her warning. I felt the undeniable truth in her words. A year ago, the mere thought of alienating Trevor would have shattered my heart. I would have paid any price, endured any humiliation simply to keep the illusion of my family intact. But the man who had desperately clung to that illusion died the moment Brooke ripped the television remote from my hand, while my son stared blankly at his phone. I felt the profound absence of the boy I had raised. He had been completely hollowed out, replaced by a weak, entitled stranger who permitted his wife to abuse the man who fed them. There was no hesitation left in my mind. There was only a cold, terrifying vacuum where my paternal devotion used to reside. "I do not have a son, Sylvia," I replied, sliding the green folder an inch closer to her side of the glass table. "I have a parasite." "Starve it." Sylvia stared at me for a long moment. She saw the absolute, uncompromising finality in my eyes. The warning had been her legal and personal obligation. Now the ruthless litigator took complete control. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. She pulled a yellow legal pad and a silver pen from her leather briefcase. "I will draft a formal 30-day notice to quit," she said, her pen gliding rapidly across the paper. "The law requires us to grant them 30 days to vacate the premises for a residential eviction. However, that timeline solely applies to the physical structure of the house." She tapped the spreadsheet detailing the interior expenses. "The property inside the house is an entirely different legal matter," she continued, a faint predatory smile touching the corners of her mouth. "You purchased the furniture. You purchased the appliances. You purchased the televisions. You own the Sub-Zero refrigerator and the smart thermostats. Because those items are your personal property, and because they are not legally bound to a tenant lease, you do not have to wait 30 days to claim them. You can legally extract your personal property the exact moment you desire." The brilliant mechanics of her strategy locked perfectly into place. I did not just have the power to evict them. I had the immediate power to completely strip away the luxurious illusion they were living in. They had claimed the living room was theirs. I was going to show them exactly what they actually owned. I accepted the timeline and thanked Sylvia for her efficiency. I left the green folder in her capable hands, stood up from the glass table, and walked out of the sterile coffee shop. I stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The cold city air hit my face, but I felt entirely invigorated. The heavy, suffocating weight of being a victim in my own home had completely vanished. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts until I found a number I had not dialed since the day I sold my logistics empire. I pressed call and held the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring through the cold air. "I was calling Apex Logistics," They were not a standard, polite residential moving company that wrapped fragile lamps in bubble wrap. Apex Logistics was a heavy commercial freight crew I used to personally command when I ran my empire. These were hardened, efficient men who dismantled and relocated entire corporate warehouses in a matter of hours. They operated with military precision, utilizing heavy-duty equipment and massive transport trucks to strip commercial spaces down to the bare concrete. I needed a crew that would not ask polite questions or hesitate when faced with domestic outrage. I needed a crew that would execute a rapid total extraction operation without a single ounce of mercy. A gruff, deep voice answered on the third ring. It was Marcus, my old general foreman. The moment he heard my voice, his tone shifted from professional annoyance to absolute respect. He had worked under my command for 2 decades, and he knew that when Stanley Mercer called, the job was serious and the pay was exceptional. I did not waste his time with small talk. I gave Marcus the address of the $1.2 million suburban estate. I told him I required 3 of his largest commercial transport trucks and a full crew of his fastest, most meticulous men. I explained that we were executing a total interior extraction of a residential property. I told him every single piece of furniture, every major appliance, and every piece of electronic equipment had to be systematically unbolted, dismantled, and loaded into the trucks with extreme prejudice. Marcus did not question the unusual nature of the request. He simply asked when I needed the crew ready to roll. I looked down the busy street, mentally calculating the timeline of my impending masterstroke. I knew Trevor and Brooke had a luxurious weekend getaway rapidly approaching on their calendar. I told Marcus to have the trucks fueled, the men briefed, and the operation ready to launch by Friday morning. The silence that had begun in my basement was about to become deafening for the parasites living above me. The extraction was officially in motion. Wednesday evening arrived with the heavy, suffocating quiet that usually followed their volatile outbursts. I remained in my concrete basement suite for most of the afternoon, meticulously preparing the final mechanism of my trap. I sat at my cheap laminate desk and pulled up the booking portal for the most exclusive luxury spa resort in the Napa Valley region. I did not search for discounted rates or promotional packages. Cheap bait does not catch arrogant prey. I selected a premium, secluded villa overlooking a private vineyard. I added a comprehensive package of deep tissue mud massages, private wine tasting excursions, and a guaranteed reservation at a boutique restaurant that famously required a 6-month waiting list to secure a single table. I upgraded their flight to first class, ensuring every step of their journey would be paved with the exact kind of unearned luxury they felt they were intrinsically owed. The total cost of the weekend excursion exceeded $10,000. I authorized the payment using an encrypted commercial account that Trevor did not even know existed. I printed the glossy multi-page itinerary and the premium boarding passes, sliding the pristine papers into a thick, cream-colored envelope made of heavy cardstock. I sealed the flap, letting my thumb run along the smooth paper. It felt incredibly heavy, not with the weight of a generous gift, but with the dense gravitational pull of absolute destruction. I walked up the wooden stairs to the main floor. The rich, salty scent of expensive takeout sushi filled the hallway. I stepped into the pristine kitchen, where the Brazilian quartz countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting. Trevor and Brooke were sitting at the massive island, picking at their food with silver chopsticks. They did not look up when the kitchen door swung open. The air in the room was thick with their manufactured victimhood. They were waiting for me to grovel. They were expecting a pathetic, broken display of submission from an old man terrified of losing his only connection to his bloodline. I was fully prepared to give them a masterpiece of a lie. I kept my posture slightly stooped, rolling my shoulders forward to mimic the physical weight of a defeated, exhausted elder. I walked slowly across the expensive hardwood floor and placed the thick cream envelope directly onto the quartz counter right between their plastic soy sauce containers. Brooke stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake, her eyes narrowing with instant, aggressive suspicion. She crossed her arms over her chest, refusing to reach for it. Trevor finally put down his silver chopsticks and looked at me, his face carrying that same exhausted, condescending irritation he had weaponized against me for months. He asked me what I was doing, treating my presence in the room like a profound inconvenience. I kept my voice incredibly soft, injecting it with the precise amount of forced humility required to sell the illusion. I told them I had spent the last 48 hours reflecting on my behavior. I said I realized my prolonged presence in the house had caused them undue stress, and that I had completely overstepped my boundaries regarding the antique furniture and the living room television. The words tasted like dry ash in my mouth, but I delivered them flawlessly. I told them I wanted to make proper amends. I wanted to give them the physical and emotional space to breathe that Trevor had so fiercely demanded. Brooke snatched the thick envelope off the polished quartz before Trevor could even extend his hand. She tore open the heavy paper flap with her long acrylic nails, her suspicion momentarily overriding her performative disgust. She pulled out the glossy itinerary and the first-class boarding passes. I stood perfectly still and watched a magnificent psychological transformation occur in real time. I watched the hard defensive lines of her face completely melt away, instantly replaced by a naked ravenous greed. Her eyes darted across the premium flight details and the five-star resort logo printed at the top of the page. She read the description of the private vineyard villa and the exclusive spa treatments. She did not ask how a retired middle manager on a fixed, depleting pension could possibly afford to drop $10,000 on a spontaneous weekend apology. She did not question the logistics of the money. She simply accepted the extravagant offering as her absolute, undeniable due. Brooke let out a loud theatrical sigh and dramatically placed her hand over her chest. She looked at me, her face glowing with a sickeningly sweet, manufactured compassion. She told me it took a very big man to admit when he was fundamentally wrong. She claimed the past few weeks had been incredibly toxic for her personal mental health, and that she desperately needed this healing high-frequency retreat to recover from the negative energy I had continually dragged into her sanctuary. Trevor picked up the boarding passes from the counter. He traced the gold foil lettering of the first-class seating assignment with his thumb and finally looked at me. He told me it was a highly appropriate start. He said he appreciated the gesture and sincerely hoped I would use the empty, quiet house this weekend to really sit down and think about how I needed to fit into their future dynamic. Brooke leaned in close to Trevor, wrapping her arm around his neck. She thought I was either too deaf or standing too far away to capture the soft words slipping past her glossy lips. But the kitchen was quiet, and my focus was absolute. I heard every single syllable drop into the air. She whispered to my son that she had finally trained the old man to know his exact place. A smug, deeply victorious smirk spread across her face as she kissed his cheek. Trevor chuckled softly, nodding in agreement, completely validating her toxic triumph. He pocketed the tickets without a single ounce of guilt or hesitation. I did not react to the insult. I did not let the icy, catastrophic rage building in my chest reach my eyes. I simply nodded my head, told them both to have a wonderful, relaxing trip, and turned my back on them. As I walked out of the kitchen, I heard Brooke immediately pick up her cellular phone to call her friends. She was already loudly and obnoxiously bragging about her spontaneous luxury getaway, claiming her husband had surprised her to make up for the severe emotional stress of dealing with his incredibly difficult father. I walked down the hallway, descended into the basement, and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I sat down in the complete darkness of my concrete suite, listening to the muffled sounds of their celebration echoing through the floorboards above my head. They honestly believed they had won the war. They believed they had successfully crushed my spirit, broken my boundaries, and reduced me to a compliant, easily manipulated wallet. They had absolutely no idea they had just willingly, joyfully stepped directly into the churning gears of an industrial crushing machine. Thursday was a masterclass in psychological endurance. I remained entirely confined to my concrete room, tracking their movements by the heavy thuds vibrating through the ceiling joists. They were packing with frantic, entitled energy. The distinct sounds of sliding closet doors, the rolling of heavy designer luggage wheels across the hardwood, and Brooke's sharp, demanding voice barking, packing instructions at Trevor filled the structure of the house. Every time I heard a heavy suitcase hit the floor, I looked at the digital extraction manifest, glowing on my laptop screen. I reviewed the itemized inventory. $1.4 million of imported furniture, premium appliances, and integrated electronics. The house was a sprawling, opulent museum of my unseen wealth, and the arrogant curators were currently packing their expensive bags to completely abandon it. I visualized the entire operation, mentally walking through every single room on the main floor. The dining room with the mahogany hutch, the kitchen with the massive stainless steel refrigerator, the living room with the leather sectional. I knew exactly which bolts needed to be unscrewed, which wires needed to be severed, and which heavy items required specialized lifting equipment. Friday morning broke with a pale, overcast light bleeding through the small high window of the basement. At precisely 6 o'clock, the frantic footsteps above me began again in earnest. Their luxury airport pickup was scheduled for 6:30. I stood at the bottom of the basement stairs, listening to the final chaotic sounds of their habitation. I heard the heavy mahogany front door swing open. I heard the distinct low idling of a premium black car service waiting patiently in the driveway. Trevor and Brooke were dragging their massive suitcases through the foyer, the wheels clattering against the imported wood. They did not walk to the basement door to say a polite goodbye. They did not leave a note on the counter thanking me for the $10,000 vacation. They did not spare a single thought for the man living beneath their feet. They simply walked out the door. The heavy front door slammed shut, the brass lock clicking into place with a sharp, metallic echo. The powerful engine of the black SUV revved, and the sound of heavy tires rolling over the decorative driveway, gravel slowly faded into the quiet, undisturbed peace of the suburban morning. The house was instantly plunged into an absolute ringing silence. It was the very first time in 2 entire years that the property felt completely empty of their toxic, suffocating entitlement. I did not walk upstairs immediately. I stood in the cool air of the stairwell and pulled my cellular phone from my pocket. I looked at the digital clock on the screen. It was exactly 6:35. The prey was officially in transit, locked safely inside a metal vehicle, hurtling rapidly toward an extravagant resort, completely blind to the reality of their impending devastation. I navigated to my encrypted contacts and pressed the button to call Apex Logistics. The phone rang only one time before the gruff, gravelly voice of my old commercial freight foreman answered the line. Marcus did not say hello. He did not offer any morning pleasantries. He simply stated he was in the cab and standing by for the absolute green light. I told him the residential property was completely clear of all hostile occupants. I told him the trap had been sprung. I gave him the single definitive command to execute the total extraction protocol immediately. I walked up the basement stairs and stepped into the main hallway. The house was perfectly, beautifully still. The pale morning light caught the dust motes floating suspended above the Brazilian quartz countertops in the empty kitchen. I walked slowly into the living room and stood directly in front of the massive picture window, looking out onto the quiet, highly manicured street. The neighboring houses sat peaceful and undisturbed behind their perfect dew-covered green lawns. I stood with my hands firmly clasped behind my back, watching the horizon, feeling the adrenaline begin to pump steadily through my veins. Exactly 12 minutes later, the solid ground beneath my leather shoes began to vibrate. It was a low, incredibly heavy mechanical rumble that rattled the decorative glass panes in the window frames. A massive, unnatural shadow fell across the pristine front lawn, blocking out the morning sun. The first commercial transport truck turned the corner onto the quiet residential street. It was a heavy-duty 18-wheel diesel rig painted a stark, unforgiving industrial black. It entirely lacked any colorful or polite moving company logos. It looked exactly like a military transport vehicle rolling into a combat zone. The massive air brakes hissed violently as the driver pulled up to the curb, the sheer size of the vehicle dominating the entire block. Immediately behind it, a second identical black freight truck made the sharp turn, its massive reinforced tires aggressively crushing the edge of the pristine sidewalk grass. A third truck followed closely behind, completing the heavy convoy. The three massive diesel engines idled in unison, producing a deafening mechanical roar that completely shattered the quiet, wealthy peace of the entire neighborhood. The heavy metal doors of the truck cabs swung open simultaneously, with loud metallic clanks. 15 men poured out onto the asphalt street. They were not wearing matching polo shirts or carrying polite customer service clipboards. They were hardened, highly experienced commercial freight handlers wearing scuffed steel-toed boots, thick canvas utility pants, and heavy leather gripping gloves. They moved with absolute terrifying military efficiency. The back grills of the three transport trucks rolled up with a loud aggressive clatter, revealing heavy motorized lift gates, stacks of thick industrial moving blankets, and heavy-duty steel dollies. Marcus stepped down from the cab of the lead truck. He was a mountain of a man, with closely cropped silver hair and a completely unreadable, hardened expression. He looked up at the massive $1.2 million house, analyzing the entry points, and then looked directly at me, standing silently in the front window. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and pushed it wide open. The crisp morning air flooded the foyer, instantly mixing with the sharp, acrid smell of heavy diesel exhaust. Marcus walked straight up the driveway, his heavy boots ruthlessly crushing the decorative gravel. He stopped at the threshold and handed me a heavy digital clipboard displaying the complete itemized inventory manifest I had provided the day before. I took the clipboard from his massive hand. I looked past him at the 15 men standing at rigid attention on my pristine front lawn, holding industrial power drills, heavy lifting straps, and commercial extraction equipment. I looked back at Marcus and gave him a single definitive nod. I told him to authorize his men to enter the property. I told him to strip the house down to the bare painted drywall and leave absolutely nothing behind but the empty space. The bait had been successfully swallowed whole, and the ruthless extraction had officially begun. The heavy diesel engines of the three commercial transport trucks continued to idle loudly outside the $1.2 million suburban home. I stood completely still in the grand foyer, holding my heavy metal clipboard. The morning air flowed through the open front doorway, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of industrial exhaust. It was a smell that reminded me of my decades building a logistics empire on the freezing loading docks. It was the scent of absolute, unyielding progress. The pristine environment of the house was about to be systematically erased. Marcus stood before me with his 15 hardened crew members. They were men who dismantled massive corporate warehouses for a living. They carried heavy-duty power drills and thick moving blankets and industrial lifting straps. They looked completely out of place standing on the imported silk rug in the entryway. That was exactly the point. I handed Marcus the thick stack of itemized manifests. I told him that every single item listed on those pages belonged entirely to me. I instructed him to extract my property with extreme precision and absolute prejudice. I told him to leave the painted drywall intact, but to strip away every single luxury fixture my hidden millions had procured for the past 2 years. I wanted the shell of the building left standing as a monument to their utter failure. Marcus did not ask any sentimental questions. He simply gave a sharp nod and turned to his men. He signaled the breach. The heavy steel-toed boots of the extraction crew crossed the threshold in unison. They fanned out across the main floor of the house with the flawless coordination of a military unit clearing a hostile zone. The quiet, suffocating oppression I had endured in the basement was finally and permanently over. The loud mechanical whir of reciprocating saws and power drills echoing through the high ceilings sounded like a symphony of pure justice. I stood in the foyer and checked off the very first box on my manifest as 2 men rolled a heavy steel dolly down the main hallway. The vibration of the heavy wheels against the expensive imported hardwood floors signaled the beginning of the end for my son and his entitled wife. The massive disturbance caused by the commercial moving crew did not go unnoticed by the surrounding neighborhood. I heard the frantic slapping of flat sandals hitting the pavement at the end of my driveway. I looked through the open doorway and watched a woman named Karen marching aggressively across my property line. Karen was the self-appointed guardian of the suburban block. She was a deeply intrusive neighbor who spent her entire existence monitoring the street for the slightest deviation from the local homeowners association guidelines. She had previously complained to Brooke about the faint smell of my basement cooking, claiming it ruined her evening walks. She wore a bright pink jogging suit and gripped a mobile phone tightly in her right hand. She stopped dead at the edge of the front porch and glared at the massive black trucks crushing the edge of the pristine lawn. She demanded to know what on earth was happening at Trevor and Brooke's beautiful residence. She loudly declared that she was observing a blatant robbery in broad daylight. She informed me that she was already dialing the local authorities to report a massive theft and a home invasion. I stepped out onto the porch into the cool morning air. I did not raise my hands to pacify her. I did not attempt to soothe her manufactured suburban panic. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper. It was a certified notarized copy of the property deed. I also pulled out my state-issued photo identification. I held both items out directly toward her face. I told her to look very closely at the legal name printed on the county document. I told her the house did not belong to Trevor or his wife. I stated with absolute chilling clarity that the property belonged entirely to me. I informed her that I was conducting a scheduled renovation of my own private residence. I advised her to turn around and walk back to her own property and mind her blooming hydrangeas. Karen squinted at the documents. Her face turned a deep, mottled shade of crimson when her eyes processed the legal truth of the paperwork. She opened her mouth to argue, but the deafening sound of a power drill tearing through metal mounting brackets inside the living room drowned out her voice. She stepped backward down the porch stairs, but she did not put her phone away. She told me she did not care what the paperwork said. She declared the situation looked highly suspicious and that the police were already on their way to arrest me. She folded her arms across her pink jogging suit and stood stubbornly at the end of my driveway, waiting for the authorities to arrive and validate her outrage. I simply turned my back on her and walked back inside the house. I had a strict operational schedule to maintain, and I refused to let a local busybody slow down my extraction. The crew was already moving the first load of boxed goods out the door, and I needed to supervise the heavy lifting. 15 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of 2 local patrol cars reflected off the shiny black paint of the transport trucks. The vehicles pulled up to the curb with their sirens silenced, but their presence demanding immediate attention. 2 uniformed police officers stepped out of their vehicles and approached the driveway. Karen immediately ran up to them, waving her arms frantically in the air. She pointed her finger at the open front door and loudly accused the moving crew of ransacking the neighborhood. She told the officers that the house belonged to a lovely young couple who were currently out of town on a highly expensive spa vacation. She demanded they draw their weapons and stop the robbery before the criminals could escape with the valuable electronics. The officers listened to her frantic pacing and then walked slowly up the driveway toward the front porch, resting their hands near their heavy utility belts. I stepped out of the house to meet them, holding a massive black binder in my left hand. The lead officer asked me to explain the situation, stating they had received a frantic report of a home invasion in progress. I did not show any signs of intimidation or nervousness. I remained completely clinical and utterly detached. I handed the officer my photo identification and the certified property deed showing the state seals and signatures. He reviewed the documents and his defensive posture instantly relaxed. I then opened the massive black binder. The binder contained hundreds of pages of meticulous financial records. I had printed the original purchase receipts for every single item currently being carried out the front door. I presented the receipts to the officers one by one. I showed them the matching serial numbers for the televisions, the kitchen appliances, and the custom furniture. I explained that I was the sole legal owner of both the physical structure of the house and every single piece of personal property inside it. I told them my tenants had grown entirely too comfortable and that I was simply reclaiming my assets while they were away on vacation. The second officer walked into the foyer and watched my crew carefully wrapping a $12,000 leather sofa in moving blankets. He looked at the receipt in the binder, confirming the exact description and purchase price of the sectional. The officers nodded to each other, communicating silently. They realized instantly that there was absolutely no crime occurring on the premises. They handed my documents back to me and apologized for the interruption. The lead officer turned around and walked back down the driveway to where Karen was standing with a smug, victorious smile on her face. He completely shattered her suburban illusion. He told Karen that the man on the porch was the legal and sole owner of the property, and that he was entirely within his rights to remove his own belongings. He explicitly stated that this was a private civil matter, and that the police had zero jurisdiction to interfere or halt the moving trucks. He firmly advised Karen to step off my driveway and stop wasting municipal resources with frivolous emergency calls. Karen stood frozen on the sidewalk, her jaw hanging open in absolute shock. Her public humiliation was absolute and complete. The police officers got back into their patrol cars and drove away, leaving the flashing lights to fade down the street. I looked at Karen one last time and gave her a single dismissive nod before turning back to my work. The physical extraction of the house was a masterpiece of mechanical precision and cold efficiency. I walked into the main living room to supervise the primary dismantling phase. The massive custom Italian leather sectional that Brooke had so violently banished me from just days prior was currently being ripped apart. 4 of my heaviest crew members were unbolting the thick steel connective brackets holding the luxurious cushions together. They flipped the heavy leather pieces upside down and wrapped them tightly in rough canvas industrial blankets. The rich, earthy smell of the premium leather was completely smothered by the dusty scent of canvas and packing tape. They hoisted the wrapped sections onto their broad shoulders and marched them straight out the front door, loading them into the cavernous belly of the first transport truck. I watched them carry away the exact spot where Brooke had told me to go back to my room. Next, they approached the wall holding the 85-inch flat-screen television. It was the exact television Trevor used to ignore my presence when I tried to speak with him. 2 men held the massive fragile glass panel steady, while a third man used a heavy power drill to reverse the thick lag bolts securing the heavy metal mount to the wooden wall studs. The high-pitched whine of the drill echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. The massive screen was lifted away from the wall, leaving behind 4 gaping, ugly holes in the pristine white drywall. The room suddenly felt incredibly empty and entirely meaningless without its central focal point. I walked into the dining room, where the mahogany hutch my late wife Patricia had restored was safely wrapped in 3 layers of protective padding. The crew carried it out with the utmost reverence, ensuring not a single scratch would touch the wood. I moved into the kitchen to oversee the appliance extraction. The quartz countertops were covered in the dust of our labor. 5 men surrounded the massive $12,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator. This was the exact machine Brooke had physically blocked me from accessing when I merely wanted a bottle of cold water. A specialized technician had already capped the municipal water lines feeding the internal ice maker to prevent any flooding. The crew tilted the towering stainless steel monolith backward onto a reinforced steel dolly. The heavy rubber wheels squeaked loudly as they rolled the massive appliance across the expensive imported tile floor. They navigated it carefully through the hallway and out the door, leaving a massive, empty rectangular void in the custom oak cabinetry. The kitchen immediately lost its luxurious modern aesthetic. It looked like an abandoned construction site. The expensive $800 espresso machine, the designer blenders, and the imported cooking equipment were violently tossed into heavy cardboard commercial moving boxes and taped shut. Every single item my money had procured to make their lives comfortable was being ruthlessly stripped away, piece by piece. The large pieces of furniture and heavy appliances were only the very first phase of the operation. The true brilliance of my retaliatory strategy lay in the meticulous micro-extraction. I was not simply taking back the couches and the televisions. I was taking back the very lifeblood and functionality of the house. I instructed Marcus to deploy his technical team throughout the upper floors. They walked through the hallways with tall aluminum ladders and specialized electrical tools. They reached up to the high ceilings and unscrewed every single expensive smart home light bulb Brooke had forced me to purchase to fit her desired aesthetic. They placed the bulbs into padded cases and replaced them with absolutely nothing. They plunged the long hallways, the modern bathrooms, and the grand foyer into deep natural shadows. The house was slowly losing its artificial brightness, returning to a primitive, dark state. I walked over to the central hallway, where the main environmental controls were securely mounted to the wall. This was the digital smart thermostat Brooke had used to lock me out of the heating system, leaving me to freeze in the basement suite while they slept in perfect warmth. A technician handed me a flathead screwdriver. I did not delegate this specific task to the crew. I pressed the metal tip into the mounting screws and twisted firmly, feeling the plastic give way. I pulled the digital screen entirely off the wall, severing the thin copper wires connecting it to the central furnace. I tossed the plastic unit directly into a nearby garbage bag. The house would no longer heat itself for them when the temperature dropped. I moved to the utility closet and ripped the high-speed internet router from its mounting bracket, severing their connection to the outside world and permanently deleting the network they had named as their private sanctuary. The extraction crew worked relentlessly and silently for 6 uninterrupted hours. When Marcus finally walked over and signaled that the operation was completely finished, I walked through the main floor to conduct a final visual inspection. The transformation was absolute and utterly devastating to the senses. They had stripped the house completely to the bare painted drywall. There was no comfortable place to sit or sleep. There was no food in a refrigerator because the refrigerator no longer existed. There was no television to distract from the deafening silence. There were no lights to illuminate the empty dark corners when the sun went down. The imported hardwood floors were covered in a thin layer of construction dust and heavy boot prints. I stood in the exact center of the massive living room. The space was completely barren. Without the heavy furniture and thick rugs to absorb the ambient sound, the room had developed a cold, harsh, hollow echo. Every time I shifted my weight or took a breath, the sound bounced off the bare walls and returned to me magnified. The house was dark, echoing, and entirely hostile to human comfort. I had removed the illusion of their success. I had extracted the exact physical cost of their profound arrogance. I walked out the front door into the afternoon sun and locked the heavy brass deadbolt, leaving the empty, echoing structure behind to wait for their inevitable return. The 3 heavy transport trucks navigated the winding suburban streets, leaving the barren echo chamber of the house far behind us. I drove my modest sedan directly behind the convoy, watching the massive black rear doors of the freight vehicles. Inside those metal boxes was the entire fabricated reality my son and his wife had built their fragile egos upon. We merged onto the interstate, heading straight for the towering steel and glass skyline of the city. The transition from the sprawling manicured lawns of the suburbs to the dense vertical architecture of the downtown district felt like shedding an incredibly heavy restrictive skin. I was no longer the tragic, forgotten widower relegated to a damp basement. I was returning to my natural environment. I directed Marcus and his crew toward a highly exclusive residential high-rise located in the exact center of the financial sector. It was a building designed specifically for individuals who valued absolute privacy and possessed the immense wealth required to enforce it. We pulled into the secure subterranean loading dock. A team of private security guards in tailored charcoal uniforms immediately verified my credentials and cleared the commercial trucks for entry. There were no nosy neighbors here. There were no panicked suburban housewives threatening to call the local authorities. There was only absolute seamless efficiency. The building possessed a dedicated freight elevator large enough to transport industrial machinery. Marcus and his men utilized it to move the wrapped furniture and heavy appliances directly up to the 42nd floor. I swiped my encrypted keycard and pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner beside the heavy steel door. The locking mechanism clicked open, revealing the penthouse. The space was a masterpiece of severe modern minimalism. The floors were polished concrete, reflecting the pale afternoon light that poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no interior walls obstructing the view. The entire residence overlooked the sprawling urban grid below, offering a commanding, unobstructed vantage point of the city. It was incredibly quiet. The thick, insulated glass completely neutralized the chaotic roar of the traffic and the sirens 40 stories down. It was an impenetrable fortress in the sky. I stood in the center of the vast, empty space and directed the moving crew. I did not want the layout to mimic the house I had just violently dismantled. I wanted to establish a completely new operational base. The men rolled the massive $12,000 Italian leather sectional into the main living area. I instructed them to position it facing the towering glass windows, completely ignoring the interior of the room. I wanted to sit on that expensive leather and watch the city move rather than stare at a television screen. The commercial kitchen appliances were integrated into the existing stainless steel galley. The Sub-Zero refrigerator that Brooke had so fiercely guarded slid perfectly into a custom alcove, but the most important piece of the extraction required my direct personal supervision. 4 men carefully carried the heavy padded form of Patricia's mahogany hutch into the penthouse. They moved with slow, deliberate steps, respecting the immense value of the wood. I directed them to place it in the exact center of the primary living space, right against a structural concrete pillar where it would catch the early morning sunlight. The men removed the thick canvas blankets and the plastic wrapping. The dark polished wood gleamed under the recessed architectural lighting. It looked completely out of place against the sterile concrete and the modern steel. But that was exactly why I wanted it there. It was a permanent physical reminder of the woman I had loved and the deep, enduring loyalty I had hopelessly tried to pass down to my son. Brooke had called it depressing garbage. Here in my fortress, it was the absolute centerpiece. Marcus approached me with his digital clipboard. He reported that the extraction and delivery were officially complete. I authorized his substantial payment, adding a heavy premium for their flawless execution and their absolute discretion. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind the departing crew, leaving me entirely alone in the massive, quiet penthouse. I walked over to the mahogany hutch. I ran my hand along the smooth, polished edge, feeling the familiar grain of the wood. The quiet peace of the moment was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, vibrating buzz in my tailored jacket pocket. I pulled out my cellular phone. The screen was illuminated with a high-priority fraud alert from my elite private banking institution. The automated message requested immediate verification for an exceptionally large transaction attempting to process on the emergency household credit card. This was the exact account I had previously linked to Trevor's suburban lifestyle. I tapped the screen to open the detailed transaction log. The geographic location of the charge was a highly exclusive 5-star restaurant located inside the luxury spa resort in Napa Valley. The exact resort I had paid $10,000 to send them to just 12 hours prior. The pending charge was for exactly $3,000. I opened the itemized billing details provided by the merchant terminal. Trevor was not attempting to pay for a room upgrade or a luxurious dinner. He was attempting to purchase a single rare bottle of vintage wine. The sheer suffocating magnitude of his hubris washed over me. I had just purchased them and all expenses paid extravagant vacation to make amends for my supposed toxic behavior. They were currently sleeping in a private vineyard villa that I had completely funded. Yet my son still felt the absolute entitled necessity to flex his fabricated wealth by ordering a $3,000 bottle of wine on my emergency credit card. He wanted to impress his wife. He wanted to demonstrate to the entire restaurant that he was a man of immense substance and power. He was drinking from a well that he truly believed would never run dry. I did not simply tap the button to decline the fraudulent transaction. Declining the charge would only generate an automated text message to his phone advising him to contact his banking provider. That was a temporary inconvenience. I required a permanent catastrophic severance. I bypassed the standard mobile application and logged directly into the secure administrative portal for my overarching wealth management trust. I navigated through the complex digital ledgers until I located the specific credit account linked to his name. I did not suspend the card. I did not place a temporary hold on the available funds. I initiated a total permanent closure of the entire credit line. The digital portal generated a final warning prompt, advising me that closing the account would instantly terminate all associated cards and immediately decline any pending transactions currently held in the merchant authorization queue. I stared at the prompt. I pictured Trevor sitting in that dimly lit upscale restaurant, wearing a custom suit I had paid for trying to impress a woman who actively despised me. I pictured the waiter standing awkwardly by the table holding the heavy leather billfold, waiting for the transaction to clear. I pressed the confirmation button. The screen flashed green, indicating the account had been successfully and permanently eradicated. The financial safety net that had protected my son from the harsh realities of the adult world for his entire life simply ceased to exist. I placed the cellular phone face down on the polished mahogany wood of Patricia's hutch. I walked over to the Italian leather sectional and sat down facing the towering glass windows. The sky outside was beginning to darken as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, deep shadows across the city skyline. I sat in the perfect absolute silence of the penthouse, knowing that 2,000 miles away, in a luxury resort in California, my son was currently staring at a declined credit card, realizing for the very first time in his pampered existence that he possessed absolutely nothing. The heavy black premium car pulled slowly onto the quiet suburban street as the Sunday evening sun began to dip below the horizon. The thick tires crushed the decorative gravel of the driveway with a slow, rhythmic crunch that signaled the end of the weekend getaway. Trevor and Brooke sat in the back seat of the spacious vehicle. The atmosphere inside the luxury car was not relaxed or rejuvenated. It was thick with a sour, simmering tension. The humiliation of the declined credit card at the five-star restaurant in Napa Valley had cast a long, dark shadow over the final 48 hours of their trip. Trevor had spent the entire return flight frantically trying to reach his private banking representative, but the weekend hours had left him entirely locked out of his accounts. Brooke had spent the flight staring out the window, nursing a silent, furious resentment that her husband had somehow failed to maintain the flawless financial facade she required. They stepped out into the cool evening air. Trevor dragged the heavy designer luggage from the trunk of the vehicle while Brooke walked ahead toward the front porch. She pulled her designer coat tighter around her shoulders, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete walkway. She was already mentally preparing the list of demands she planned to hurl at me the second she stepped inside the house. She wanted to make it absolutely clear that my attempt at a financial apology did not excuse my toxic presence in her sanctuary. She reached the top of the stairs and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the mahogany front door. She pushed forward, intending to rest her weight against the wood while she waited for Trevor to retrieve his keys. The heavy mahogany door drifted open with a soft metallic click. It was completely unlocked. Brooke froze on the threshold. She pushed the thick wood wider and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside the house felt completely wrong. It lacked the warm ambient temperature regulated by the smart thermostat. It lacked the faint artificial scent of the expensive vanilla diffusers she kept plugged into the hallway outlets. The air was incredibly stale, carrying a dry, dusty scent that smelled like raw construction materials and disturbed concrete. She reached her hand out toward the wall panel and flicked the switch for the recessed overhead lighting. A hollow click echoed off the walls. Nothing happened. The grand foyer remained buried in the deep, natural shadows of the setting sun. Trevor dragged the two massive suitcases over the threshold, his breathing heavy from the exertion. He asked Brooke why she was standing in the dark. He reached past her and flicked the hallway switch himself. The identical hollow click echoed through the space. He pulled his cellular phone from his coat pocket and activated the bright digital flashlight. He aimed the harsh white beam down the length of the main corridor. The circle of light swept across the imported hardwood floors, revealing a thick layer of fine white drywall dust covering the pristine surface. Trevor stepped past his wife, his expensive leather shoes leaving sharp, visible footprints in the dust. He walked slowly into the massive living room. He swept the beam of his phone across the space, and his breath caught painfully in his throat. The room was an absolute cavernous void. The sprawling custom Italian leather sectional was completely gone. The thick woven area rugs were missing. He raised the trembling beam of light toward the primary wall. The 85-inch flat-screen television was gone, leaving behind 4 ugly, jagged holes in the white drywall, where the heavy metal mounting brackets had been violently extracted. Small piles of plaster dust sat on the floor directly beneath the structural wounds. Brooke dropped her heavy designer handbag onto the wooden floor. The impact created a loud, harsh slap that bounced aggressively off the bare walls. The entire house possessed a terrifying hollow echo. She ran past Trevor, her heels slipping slightly on the dusty floorboards, and rushed directly into the kitchen. She let out a sharp, gasping breath. The massive $12,000 stainless steel refrigerator was gone. A dark, empty rectangular cavity sat in the middle of her pristine custom oak cabinetry. The Brazilian quartz countertops were completely bare. The expensive espresso machine, the designer blenders, the imported knife sets, and the brushed steel bar stools had vanished without a single trace. She turned around, wildly, looking at the ceiling. She realized every single smart light bulb had been unscrewed and stripped from the recessed fixtures. The house was entirely dead. Brooke stumbled backward into the hallway, her chest heaving as she began to hyperventilate. Her carefully constructed reality was shattering into millions of jagged pieces around her. She screamed into the dark, echoing space. She screamed that they had been robbed. She frantically grabbed Trevor's arm, digging her sharp acrylic nails into his expensive jacket. She demanded he call the police immediately. She shrieked that the old man must have forgotten to set the security alarm when he left, and that criminals had completely cleaned them out while they were suffering in California. Trevor did not reach for his phone to dial emergency services. He stood perfectly rigid in the center of the barren living room. The bright beam of his digital flashlight was pointed directly at the middle of the bare hardwood floor. The pale orange glow of the street lamp outside the massive front window cast long, creeping shadows across the room, but the harsh white beam of the phone illuminated a single, solitary object. It was not a piece of trash. It was a crisp white sheet of heavy legal paper resting perfectly flat against the dusty wood. Trevor walked slowly toward the center of the room. His legs felt incredibly heavy, as if he were walking through deep water. He reached down and picked up the paper. His hands were shaking so violently, the sharp beam of light danced frantically across the dark walls. He forced himself to focus on the dense black text printed on the page. He read the official municipal seal at the top. He read the legal classifications: month to month, tenant at will, termination of occupancy, immediate extraction of personal assets. It was a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises signed by a senior corporate litigator. The absolute truth of his existence crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing building. They had not been robbed by random criminals. They had been systematically and ruthlessly excised by the very man they had treated like a captive animal. The old man did not just leave. The old man owned the very ground they stood upon. He owned the walls, the roof, and every single luxury they had falsely claimed as their own. Trevor stared at the piece of paper, realizing that the declined credit card at the luxury restaurant was not a banking error. It was the first strike of a total financial annihilation. Brooke snatched the paper out of his trembling hands. She held it up to the beam of the flashlight, her eyes darting frantically across the legal terminology. She read the words demanding her immediate evacuation from the property. She read the explicit detailing of the extracted personal assets. The realization hit her physical body like a violent electric shock. She dropped the paper to the floor. She let out a loud, guttural scream that tore through the empty, echoing house. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of absolute purest agony. Her entire fabricated identity, her perceived wealth, and her profound suburban arrogance had been stripped away, leaving her standing in the dark, covered in drywall dust, with absolutely nothing to her name. Trevor pulled his phone back up to his chest. His thumbs moved clumsily across the glass screen. The arrogant, entitled son, who had demanded his father learn his place, was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, desperate man staring directly into the abyss of his own ruin. He bypassed his contacts and dialed my number from memory. He brought the phone to his ear, listening to the hollow electronic ringing sound, bridging the distance between his empty nightmare and my current reality. 40 stories above the dense downtown financial district, the air inside my luxury penthouse was perfectly still and exceptionally calm. I sat comfortably on the thick cushions of the Italian leather sectional that Marcus and his commercial crew had delivered 2 days prior. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the sprawling city grid. The thousands of tiny moving headlights from the vehicles below looked like a vibrant, glowing river of endless energy. The environment was immaculate, secure, and completely impenetrable. My cellular phone sat resting on the polished dark wood of the restored mahogany hutch my late wife had loved so dearly. The device was perfectly centered on the surface, catching the soft, ambient glow of the recessed architectural lighting. The sudden sharp vibration of the phone broke the absolute silence of the penthouse. The screen illuminated brightly in the dim room. I did not move from the leather couch. I turned my head slowly and looked at the glowing digital display. The name Trevor flashed across the screen in bold black letters. The phone vibrated a second time, sliding a fraction of an inch across the smooth, polished wood. It vibrated a third time, pushing a low, urgent humming sound into the quiet air. I knew exactly where he was standing. I knew exactly what he was looking at. I could picture the deep shadows of the empty living room, the thick layer of white plaster dust coating his expensive shoes, and the cold, terrifying panic seizing his chest. He was calling to demand answers. He was calling to beg for an explanation. He was calling to desperately negotiate a surrender because he finally understood that the man he thought he controlled possessed the absolute power to erase him from the map. I remained seated. I rested my arms on the cool leather of the sectional and watched the glowing screen. I did not feel a single drop of sorrow. I did not feel the lingering ache of a broken father. The parasite had been starved and the diseased limb had been completely severed. I watched the bright digital screen illuminate the dark mahogany wood for 30 uninterrupted seconds. I listened to the frantic, desperate vibrations echo through the massive, quiet penthouse. I watched the phone ring and ring until the incoming call finally timed out and the digital screen faded completely to black. I turned my gaze back to the towering glass windows and watched the city lights burn brilliantly against the dark sky. The silence in the room was absolute, and it was finally my own. The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete floors of the downtown financial district. I sat at the far end of a massive obsidian conference table located on the 42nd floor of the most prestigious corporate law firm in the city. Sylvia Russo sat directly across from me. She wore a tailored navy blue suit that commanded absolute authority in the sterile room. The walls were constructed entirely of thick, soundproof glass, overlooking the sprawling urban grid below. It was an environment built specifically for the ruthless execution of power. There were no comfortable chairs and no warm family photographs. There was only cold, hard truth. We were waiting in total silence. The security desk in the main lobby had called up 10 minutes prior to inform us that a highly agitated man claiming to be my son was demanding immediate access to the floor. Sylvia had authorized his clearance with a simple wave of her hand. We knew he was coming. We knew the exact sequence of events that had driven him to run through the city streets on a Monday morning. He had returned to an empty, echoing shell of a house, and his fabricated reality had violently collapsed. The heavy oak door of the conference room swung open with incredible force. It hit the rubber wall stop with a loud aggressive thud that echoed through the quiet space. Trevor stumbled into the room. He looked absolutely unrecognizable. The smug, arrogant young man who had smirked at my humiliation in the kitchen just 3 days ago had been entirely erased from existence. His expensive designer shirt was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. His hair was a chaotic, uncombed mess. The dark, heavy bags under his eyes indicated he had not slept a single second since walking into his barren, dark home on Sunday evening. Brooke was not standing beside him. She had likely stayed behind, sitting on the dusty hardwood floor, mourning the catastrophic loss of her imported furniture and her premium appliances. Trevor was entirely alone. He stood in the doorway breathing heavily, his chest heaving with a mixture of pure panic and uncontrolled rage. He looked wildly around the massive, intimidating conference room before his bloodshot eyes finally locked onto my face. He marched rapidly toward the obsidian table. He slammed his bare hands down onto the polished stone surface. He demanded to know exactly what I had done to his home. His voice cracked loudly, echoing off the thick glass walls. He screamed that he had returned from a miserable, humiliating weekend trip, only to find his beautiful house completely ransacked and destroyed. He accused me of hiring a gang of common criminals to break into his property while he was out of town. He pointed his trembling finger directly at my chest and declared he was going to contact the local authorities to file massive criminal charges against me. He threatened to sue me for every single dime I possessed. He claimed I had stolen his personal belongings and completely ruined his entire life. He demanded the immediate return of his televisions, his couches, and his custom kitchen equipment, or he would personally ensure I spent the rest of my miserable, pathetic life rotting in a concrete prison cell. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let him expend all of his frantic, desperate energy. I let his empty threats bounce harmlessly around the sterile room. I felt absolutely nothing for the man standing before me. The father who would have wept at this division was dead. Sylvia stopped typing on her laptop. She closed the silver machine with a soft, definitive click that immediately commanded the attention of the room. She looked up at Trevor with the exact same clinical detachment she utilized to dismantle hostile corporate empires. She reached over to her leather briefcase resting on the floor. She pulled out a massive, heavy black binder. It was the exact identical binder I had presented to the confused police officers on Friday morning. Sylvia slid the heavy binder slowly across the smooth obsidian table. It moved with a quiet sliding sound and came to a stop directly in front of Trevor's trembling hands. She instructed him to open the cover. She kept her voice incredibly low, steady, and entirely professional. She told him he could not legally sue a man for simply reclaiming his own personal property. Trevor stared at the black binder as if it were a bomb. He slowly reached out and flipped open the thick plastic cover. Inside were hundreds of pages of meticulous financial records. Sylvia began to systematically narrate his absolute failure. She pointed her manicured finger at the very first page. She explained that it was the official certified municipal deed to the property, proving beyond any legal doubt that I was the sole registered owner of the physical structure and the land it rested upon. She told him to turn the page. He flipped the heavy paper. She pointed to the itemized purchase receipts for the $12,000 Italian leather sectional, the Sub-Zero refrigerator, the 85-inch flat-screen television, and the custom oak cabinetry. She told him to look very closely at the billing information. She told him that my name and my signature were printed clearly on every single document. She explained with ruthless clarity that legally he owned absolutely nothing inside that suburban estate. He did not own the painted drywall. He did not own the hardwood floor. He did not own the couch he sat on, the bed he slept in, or the smart light bulbs that illuminated his evenings. She told him he was nothing more than a month-to-month tenant at will, who had been legally and formally served with a 30-day notice to vacate the premises. Trevor looked up from the dense stack of financial documents. His eyes were wide with pure, terrified realization. The aggressive bluster had completely drained from his body. He looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression. He asked me how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. He asked me how I could leave them standing in an empty, dark house with nowhere to sit, nowhere to sleep, and nowhere to eat. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. I felt a profound coldness settle deep within my bones. "You said it was your living room, Trevor," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of any residual anger. "I just took what was mine out of it. You have 29 days to find your own living room." The remaining color vanished entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He staggered backward slightly, hitting the edge of a heavy leather guest chair. The absolute reality of his situation was finally suffocating him. He realized he could not fight this legal extraction with suburban entitlement or loud complaints. He realized he needed serious, high-powered legal representation to combat the forces sitting across the table. He puffed his chest out, trying to muster one final pathetic display of false authority. He looked at Sylvia and told her he was going to hire the absolute best defense attorney in the entire state. He declared he was going to access the family trust accounts and drain them completely to fight this eviction in civil court until I had absolutely nothing left to my name. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cellular phone, threatening to call a premium law firm right then and there to initiate a massive counter-lawsuit. Sylvia did not even flinch at his empty declaration. She simply reached back into her dark leather briefcase. She pulled out a single crisp piece of white paper. She extended her arm, holding the document out across the obsidian table toward him. She told him he might want to review his current financial standing before he started making expensive promises to corporate defense attorneys. Trevor snatched the paper from her hand. It was a certified digital printout from the elite private banking institution. It was the official administrative ledger for the emergency household credit card and the linked family trust accounts. Trevor read the harsh black text printed on the page. The accounts had not been temporarily frozen or placed under review. They had been completely and permanently eradicated. His name had been officially and legally removed as an authorized user from every single financial asset I controlled. His luxury lifestyle, his premium spa vacations, and his custom-tailored suits were entirely gone. Sylvia looked at him with absolute unforgiving coldness. She informed him that his current net worth was exactly zero. She told him he did not possess the financial resources to hire a junior paralegal, let alone a senior corporate defense attorney. She advised him to stop wasting his breath making empty threats in a corporate law firm, and instead spend his remaining 29 days packing his designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. Trevor stood in the silent glass room holding the piece of banking paper. His hands shook violently. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The profound, staggering magnitude of his arrogance had finally caught up to him. He looked at me one last time, searching for any trace of the accommodating father he had happily abused for years. He found absolutely nothing. He dropped the piece of paper onto the floor, turned around, and walked slowly out of the conference room, a completely broken and permanently ruined man. 2 full weeks had passed since the ruthless extraction. 14 days of absolute, uninterrupted silence had settled into the vast concrete and glass space of my downtown penthouse. The air up there was perfectly still and entirely my own. There were no shrill demands echoing down the hallway. There were no heavy, entitled footsteps vibrating through the ceiling above my head. There was only the quiet, predictable hum of the city moving hundreds of feet below my window. I sat on my Italian leather sectional, drinking a simple cup of black coffee. I felt a profound, undeniable peace radiating through my bones. It was a deep, restorative calm that I had not experienced in years. The parasite was completely gone. The heavy, suffocating burden of pretending to be a compliant, weak-old man had been completely lifted from my shoulders. Yet a quiet, clinical curiosity lingered in my mind. I did not feel any regret. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal guilt. I merely possessed the cold, detached interest of a scientist waiting to observe the final biological results of a perfectly executed experiment. I wanted to see what happened when a creature entirely dependent on a host was finally forced to survive in the harsh, unforgiving elements. I finished my coffee and walked down to the subterranean parking garage. The weather outside was bitterly cold. A flat gray winter sky hung heavily over the city, threatening to drop freezing rain onto the pavement. I got into my modest, unassuming sedan and merged onto the highway, heading away from the towering steel skyline. I drove steadily toward the wealthy, manicured suburbs. The heater in my car hummed quietly, keeping the cabin perfectly warm against the biting chill outside. I navigated the winding, familiar streets until I reached the exact neighborhood where my former property sat. I did not pull into the driveway. I parked my sedan flush against the curb about 50 yards down the quiet residential street. The engine continued to idle softly. I kept the heater running and looked through the windshield at the massive $1.2 million estate. The physical transformation of the property was deeply striking. From the outside, the brick in the roof remained completely identical. But the soul of the house had been entirely eradicated. The large picture windows were dark and utterly lifeless. There was no warm ambient glow spilling out onto the front lawn. The house looked like a hollow, abandoned shell. It looked exactly like a tomb. I sat in the warm car and watched the dead structure for 10 quiet minutes. The suburban street was entirely deserted. The wealthy neighbors were likely tucked away inside their warm, heated homes, hiding from the bitter cold. Then the heavy mahogany front door was violently thrown open. The solid wood slammed aggressively against the exterior brick wall with a loud, sharp crack that echoed down the quiet street. Brooke stormed out onto the front porch. She was not wearing her elegant designer coat or her perfectly applied makeup. She looked entirely frantic and deeply unhinged. Her face was flushed dark red with absolute fury. Her arms were wrapped tightly around a massive, chaotic bundle of fabric. It was a large collection of the expensive, custom-tailored suits and premium imported dress shirts belonging to Trevor. She marched to the edge of the porch and hurled the massive pile of clothing directly onto the dormant winter grass. The expensive fabrics tumbled through the freezing air and landed in a pathetic heap on the frozen dirt. Brooke did not stop. She turned around and marched right back into the dark, echoing house. A few seconds later, Trevor stumbled out the front door. He looked completely and utterly destroyed. He was wearing a thin gray sweater and dark slacks. He hugged his arms tightly across his chest, shivering violently in the freezing wind. The smart thermostat I had ripped from the wall had guaranteed they spent the last 2 weeks sleeping in a giant concrete icebox. The physical toll of the cold and the absolute financial ruin was clearly visible on his pale, hollow face. He walked down the porch stairs and stood in the middle of the driveway, looking at his expensive wardrobe scattered across the dead grass. Brooke emerged from the house a second time, carrying another massive armful of his belongings. She carried leather shoes, silk ties, and expensive belts. She threw them violently off the porch, watching them bounce and scatter across the concrete walkway. Trevor raised his hands, pleading with her to stop. He looked incredibly weak and pathetic. I cracked my car window just a fraction of an inch to let the sound travel into the cabin. The freezing air rushed in, carrying the sharp, undeniable sound of their total marital disintegration. Brooke was screaming at the top of her lungs. She did not care if the nosy neighbors were listening. Her luxurious illusion had been permanently shattered, and her resulting rage was entirely uncontrollable. She yelled that he was a complete and absolute fraud. She screamed that he had promised her a life of endless luxury and guaranteed wealth. She told him she had spent the last 14 days freezing to death in an empty, dark box because he was too weak and too stupid to control his own father. Trevor tried to step forward and grab her arm. He begged her to calm down. He told her he could fix the situation. He promised her he would find a way to access the bank accounts and hire a team of lawyers to force me to return their furniture. Brooke let out a loud, harsh laugh that sounded like cracking ice. She shoved his hands away from her coat. She told him he was completely delusional. She screamed that they had exactly $0 to their name. She reminded him that his credit cards were permanently declined and that they could not even afford to buy a hot meal, let alone a corporate defense attorney. She looked at him with a facial expression of absolute pure disgust. She told him she did not sign up to live in poverty. She stated she had only tolerated his insufferable personality because she believed he was the sole heir to a massive fortune. Now that the fortune was gone, he possessed absolutely no value to her. She called him a pathetic, useless parasite who had managed to lose his only host. The absolute profound irony of her words echoed through the cold air. She had spent 2 years acting as a secondary parasite, happily draining my resources through my son. Now that the primary host had vanished, they were violently turning on each other to survive. Brooke turned her back on him and walked briskly toward her sleek white luxury vehicle parked on the edge of the driveway. Trevor ran after her. His voice cracked loudly as he begged her not to leave him alone in the freezing, empty house. He told her they only had 15 days left before the formal eviction notice forced them out onto the street. He pleaded with her to stay and help him figure out a plan. Brooke ignored him completely. She pulled open the door and slid onto the premium leather seat. She slammed the heavy car door shut, severing his desperate pleas. Trevor stood on the driveway and pressed his bare hands against the cold, tinted glass of the window. He looked like a desperate drowning man reaching for a life raft. The powerful engine of the luxury vehicle roared to life. A thick plume of white exhaust poured from the tailpipes into the freezing air. Brooke shifted the car into reverse. She accelerated aggressively backward, forcing Trevor to jump out of the way to avoid being struck by the heavy side mirror. The tires kicked up a spray of decorative gravel as the car backed violently out into the street. Brooke shifted into drive and slammed her foot onto the gas pedal. The white car sped rapidly down the suburban road, disappearing around the corner without a single moment of hesitation. She abandoned him in the exact same cold, ruthless manner she had previously demanded he abandon me. Trevor was left entirely alone. He stood in the exact center of the long paved driveway, surrounded by his ruined custom clothing and expensive leather shoes. The bitter winter wind whipped past his thin sweater, causing him to tremble uncontrollably. He slowly dropped his arms to his sides. The absolute crushing reality of his total isolation settled heavily onto his drooping shoulders. He had absolutely no money. He had no wife. He had no furniture. He had no warmth. He had no future. He turned his head slowly, looking down the empty length of the quiet residential street. His bloodshot, desperate eyes scanned the parked vehicles. They drifted past the manicured lawns and the dormant winter trees. Then his gaze landed directly on my modest, unassuming sedan, idling quietly by the curb. He recognized the vehicle instantly. He froze in place. Across 50 yards of freezing air and empty asphalt, our eyes locked. I looked at the boy I had raised. I looked at the son I had worked freezing loading docks to provide for. I saw the absolute ruin he had brought upon himself through his own profound greed and his endless, breathtaking arrogance. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. His chest was heaving. He expected me to react. He expected the old, accommodating father to emerge from the vehicle. He expected me to open the car door, walk down the street, and wrap a warm coat around his shivering shoulders. He expected me to forgive his trespasses and offer him a safe, comfortable path out of the destruction he had engineered. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of paternal forgiveness had been completely, permanently drained. There was no love left to give, and there was no anger left to express. There was only the cold, objective finality of a completed transaction. I did not raise my hand to wave. I did not nod my head. I simply placed my finger on the electronic window control resting on my door panel. I pressed the small plastic button. The thick glass window glided smoothly upward, sliding perfectly into the rubber weather, stripping and sealing the warm cabin of my car from the freezing outside world. I shifted the transmission into drive. I took my foot off the brake pedal and pressed gently onto the accelerator. The sedan pulled smoothly away from the curb. I drove slowly down the quiet street, passing right by the dark, empty shell of the estate. I did not look out the side window as I passed him. I did not look into the rearview mirror to watch him standing frozen in the driveway. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the road ahead. The parasitic cord was permanently, definitively severed, and I drove quietly back into the city to live the rest of my life in absolute, unbroken peace. The lesson learned from this story is that true respect and genuine love cannot be purchased or sustained by endless financial sacrifice. When a person completely surrenders their own boundaries to satisfy the bottomless greed of entitled individuals, they only create parasites who view them as a resource rather than a human being. Realizing your own self-worth often requires the difficult choice to walk away from toxic relationships, even when those relationships involve your own family members. Taking back your power is the only way to restore natural order and achieve absolute peace. Please share your thoughts on this story by leaving a comment below.